His name is Roger Caleb Rogerson, and there's little doubt he's the most controversial cop in Australian history. In his heyday, he was a brilliant detective, there's no doubt about that. Smart, pragmatic, a born leader. He was one of the hard men of the New South Wales police force, leading from the front and putting the crooks where they truly belonged, behind bars. Sometimes Roger went a bit further. As far as we know, he's the only cop to have shot dead 3 criminals on 3 separate occasions, all in the line of duty, as the courts later found. He was both respected and feared. But then, at the very peak of his career, it all came crashing down. In a relatively short space of time, he went from hero to villain, accused of murder, bribery, corruption, perverting the course of justice. So how on earth did it all go wrong? Well, you're about to hear from the man himself, Roger Rogerson. Complex, charismatic, always controversial. This is his story.
Diamonds in his eyes, kind that you can't see inside your disguise. Where he wants to be. You think that you're so smart with everything you say, that he can feel your heart every game you play. Don't talk so loud.
I joined the New South Wales Police Service as a police cadet in January 1958. I was then 17 years of age. I just turned 17 that month. And I spent 2 years as a police cadet, where I learnt the things that normal police cadets learn: shorthand, typing and law to some extent. And we did a lot of physical training, of course. And as a cadet, my first transfer to a station was to the Glebe Police Station, which was a very old police station and of course an old part of Sydney.
Give me some idea of the sort of things you did as a police cadet in Glebe. You're in the inner city. It's a pretty gritty, sort of still is to a certain extent. I mean, it's a bit gentrified, but back in those days would have been fairly gritty. What sort of duties did you have?
My first duty when I got to Glebe Police Station every morning at about 11 o'clock was to check on the clients who'd been arrested and were in the cells overnight. And most of these were old guys who had been locked up for the old offence of drunkenness, which they don't do anymore, I don't think. And these poor old buggers had been locked up overnight and were in a pretty bad way. Now, I had to check to make sure that they were alive and kicking. And then my next duty was that we had a huge, would have been about a 1 metre high, it was an old earthenware ink jar, where back in the 20s and 30s, I'd imagine, well, it wasn't a matter of imagining, the police used to make their own ink because there were no such thing as biros. And they made ink and put it into this big container, and they used to fill up all the ink wells. Well, it hadn't been used as an ink container for many years, but when each customer came in charged with drunk, they were searched, and whatever they had in their pocket in regard to alcohol, whatever it was, whether it was maybe a bit of brandy or a leftover beer or scotch or methylated spirits, anything at all, was put into this great huge vat, and it was allowed to percolate away, and this was their elixir. So every morning there were 6 enamel cups. I can remember these enamel cups. They were about that round, and they were always green and horrible looking. And I'd go over to this great vat, and I'd tip it over on its side, and I'd fill up one of these cups with about half fill it up, shake it around. It was like soldering flux. It turned that cup into a brand new shiny cup. Then I'd do all the others, and then I'd throw that out, and then I would half fill each of these cups, or to the amount of people who were in the cells. It might have been 5, 6, 4, and then I'd give each one of these old guys a drink, and I'd pass it through the cell door, and their hands would be shaking like mad, and I would pass it over, and they'd grab hold of it, and they'd bring it to their lips, and then they'd take a couple of swallows, and then they'd give a shake and a shudder, and then they'd be as right as rain. And then, of course, about half hour later, they were taken over to the courthouse where the magistrate would admonish and discharge them. The old Glebe courthouse was still there. And off they'd go, and then I'd probably see them 2 or 3 days later when they got gathered up by the paddy wagon going around the streets again.
You've said when you joined and you know, talked about that initial period. Why did you want to be a police officer?
I joined the police cadets. My mother didn't want me to be a police officer. My mother said I should have been an engineer. I was reasonably bright at school, but I had a cousin who had joined the cadets. He was a couple of years older than me, and he was there for about 12 months, and he used to tell me about all the fantastic things they did, and then suddenly he was no longer in the cadets. He had actually, his dad, who was then my uncle, my father's sister's husband, he'd been a captain of a small boat in the English Channel during the Second World War, and he was an unbelievably brave guy. He used to go backwards and forwards across the Channel every night and bring back people escaping the Nazis and bring soldiers back and what have you. Just an unbelievably brave man. But when they migrated to Australia in 1949, he got a job as a captain of one of the coastal boats that used to, you know, ply around Australia then. And so suddenly I caught up with Sean, my cousin. I said, how's the cadets going, mate? He said, no, he said, I've left the cadets. He said, I couldn't stand the violence. He said, I was at Redfern. He said, it was dreadful. The police are just such violent people. So he said, I'm now on the ship. He said, Dad's got me a job on one of the coastal boats. He said, I'm now a seaman. It's still, my appetite was still whetted for joining the police cadets. And I got to know a couple of other blokes who joined the cadets, Keith Smith and 1 or 2 other blokes. And so I was still hell-bent on joining.
What was it that attracted you to it? Was there something you thought? Was there some sort of thing that attracted you to it? Did you see some sort of service there? Did you think this will be exciting, or were you just a kid who thought this could be a bit of an adventure?
I really don't know why I joined. As I said, my father was very much against the police. He hated the police, to be quite truthful. He was an old boilermaker, an old pommy boilermaker who'd come out from Yorkshire, and he didn't have a kind word to say about the cops, and not long before he died, he still had the same thoughts. But and I had another relative who was a policeman. He had no influence on me. I think I just decided that I'd like to be a cop.
You've joined the cops. Did you? Was there something in you that said, "I want to be a detective"? Tell me how you're drawn to that line of work, which is obviously a few years later, but that's clearly.
When I was sworn in as a constable, it was on my 19th birthday, and that was in early 1960, and I was transferred to Bankstown. Now, we had moved from Bondi to Bankstown when I was a 6-year-old kid. I went to Bankstown Central School, went to Homebush Boys High School, but I knew pretty well everyone, all the young people around the place, because I'd gone to school with them. I really enjoyed the life as a policeman. It was exciting. I often think about the hours we used to work. In uniform then at Bankstown, we used to work shifts starting at 5 in the morning till 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then from 1 till 9. And then the night shift was 9 till 5. But when you're on night shift, you actually did 6 weeks night work straight. But during that time, we were tearing around the area. It was a huge area of Bankstown in 2 paddy wagons. And we were forever locking up people doing break-and-enters, doing busts or break-and-enters on garages, or there were service stations, and on the factories around Villawood and Padstow that were all springing up back in those days. It was just becoming a new industrial area, Bankstown. But it was just great fun. I just loved the work, and I loved the camaraderie. I worked with a great team of uniformed blokes. And then I was making good arrests because I knew that I knew a lot of these guys. I'd been to school with them, the car thieves and the break-and-enter merchants. And I was getting bits and pieces of information even back in those days, and I was passing that on to the local detectives, and then they invited me to apply for plain clothes. Now, I nearly didn't go into plain clothes because I actually had become involved with the St George Police Boys Club, and I was actually a musical instructor there. And they had a musical society where it was the only police boys club back in the 50s, the late 50s, that actually invited girls to come along. And there were some very attractive young ladies that went along to this St George Police Boys Club and were in the musical society. And I was very attracted to them as well. And I actually was the musical director. I had learnt, my mother had me taught classical piano. I spent 6 years being taught, and I could play pretty well back in those days, not so good now with my arthritis. But I was the musical director, and I really enjoyed doing shows, putting shows together with a guy who had actually been my shorthand instructor when I was a cadet, a guy named Sergeant Joe Hall. And that nearly swayed me not to, but I then liked the other side of life. I liked the work. I thought I'd like being a detective, and hence I became one.
Just before you get to be a detective, if my memory's right, excuse me, you're in Bankstown, you're driving the F100, I think. This is, I'm alluding to your first significant pinch here. This is a bloke who's got stolen parts. Tell me that story.
I suppose one of the things that really convinced me that I should go into plain clothes, I was working the paddy wagon these days, we called them, I think it was 1901. And I was with a guy named Murray Douglas, and Murray had been, I suppose, for 20 years at police headquarters, where he had a job where he used to look after the supply of police motor cars to every police station in the state. So he'd never been on the street much. Well, he hadn't been for donkey's years anyhow. And he was made a third-class sergeant, so he was transferred out of there back to Bankstown on general duties. Murray soon got the hang of it, and he loved working with us young fellows because we were really all keen. So this day, Murray and I were on the paddy wagon. We were just about due to go back and knock off. We're driving along Johnson Road, Bass Hill, up towards where the Bass Hill Drive-In was built. And here was an old black Dodge with the back door open. And that was a 1934 Plymouth. And we could see what looked like the barrel of a gun sticking out past the edge of the door. And then we looked over to our left to this paddock, and we saw a number of goats, and we could hear shots being fired. So we said to ourselves, hello, hello, hello. I think this bloke's trying to shoot these goats here. So we sort of slowly pulled up behind, and as we did, suddenly the car took off. We saw a body jump from the back seat over the front bench seat, because all old cars then had a bench seat. And suddenly the car roared into life, and the back door was still open, this back door which opened backwards like a suicide door. And it did a U-turn in front of us and then roared away behind us. So I had to swing the paddy wagon around. And I took off after him, and I took off so fast that I couldn't get it out of second gear. The motor was over revving, the V8 in the F100. So I had to slow down a little bit to get it from second gear into third gear, because we never used first gear. That was only if we were climbing a mountain. Anyhow, I'm sure we were doing 70 or 80 mile an hour, and we were roaring down Rex Road, and suddenly there were all these things flying out from this car. You know, there was a gearbox and batteries and radiators, and anyhow, it kept going and hit bumps and running off the road. So I kept right on its tail. Got down to Henry Lawson Drive, and I thought, well, there's going to be a hell of a prank here, because even back in those days, Henry Lawson Drive at George's Hall was fairly busy. Amazingly enough, there was no traffic. So he's done a right-hand turn onto Henry Lawson Drive to head up towards the Hume Highway at about 50 mile an hour, and we're right on his hammer. So I've swung around behind him, and somehow the paddy wagon didn't turn over. We've roared up Henry Lawson Drive, and then he swung into where the Scout Jamboree had been held not long before. And as he's turned, he's lost control on the gravel, and the car's actually rolled over, and it's rolling over ahead of us. It must have rolled over 4 or 5 times, this big old Plymouth going up and down and crashing down, and things were flying out of it as this happened. And I'm trying to stop our police truck from hitting it. And I can remember whilst this high-speed chase was going on, I looked across at Murray Douglas, Sergeant Douglas. And he was about 6'6" tall and only weighed about 10 stone. And he was stretched out like a stick. He had his feet, his boots jammed on the floor. and his head back jammed in the corner against the door, because there were no seat belts in anything back in those days, no seat belts, no heaters, no nothing in police vehicles. And I'm sure he was petrified, because he knew a fair bit about cars, having worked at the motor vehicle section for 20 years. He must have thought, well, I don't know how good this bloke is as a driver, but he'd probably kill me before we get to a stop. But I didn't. And that guy was actually wanted. His name was Loudon. And he was wanted for about, I don't know, at least 10 or 12 car thefts and numerous numbers of break and enters. And the detectives were called, because we called them down, and as well as an ambulance to take him to the hospital. He had a bit, bits and pieces knocked off him. And then it was that moment on that I was then requested, I was asked if I would come into plain clothes.
How did you feel? Do you remember how you felt that day? You've obviously brought your vehicle to a halt. You've got him. He's clearly still alive. I hope he's still alive. He's all right. Well, he's all right, but he's. How did you feel? Tell me. Do you remember what was going through your mind?
Well, that particular day, I felt fantastic, because this was a bloke who had tried to get away from us. We'd been able to stick to his tail. We'd really made a very successful arrest. He was actually heading up. We found out later he was actually heading up Henry Wilson Drive to where he lived at Villawood, so it was well, that was our job. I mean, and that's where Bankstown was terrific for young blokes, because this happened all the time. There was so much work. If you couldn't, no one could ever say that they could do a couple of shifts without getting a good arrest, because you wouldn't be trying. You'd be sitting back in the police station having a cup of coffee. As soon as you left and got into a police car, you had work, and that normally ended up in an arrest somewhere.
Let's go back to moving into detective work. Tell me, I think you first went to the motor squad, but really the first, the first really big thing is you're seconded to 21 Division. Tell me, what was 21 Division, and what was the first time you went there, and why?
When we went into plain clothes back in those days, you'd start off at a police station, and you'd do what was called the A list, and you'd work with the local detectives for about 6 months, and they would assess you as to your ability or not. And then you would go on a list. You'd go before what was called the bull ring, and you'd have to go into the CIB, and I remember my trip in there, and I can remember meeting Detective Inspector Ray Kelly for the first time. He was a famous detective, which we'd all read about and knew about. He, of course, he was known as Gunner Kelly. He had been involved in quite a few shootings, and of course had shot a man dead in the line of duty, and that name stuck with him right through the rest of his life. But I looked up to blokes like him, because they were the blokes who kept the place nice and clean and tidy. And he put you through the paces. You had to sort of know about a few local crims and who was on the wanted list, and you sort of were well and truly, you knew exactly what the type of question they'd be asking you, so you were ready for them. And but I was just so impressed by going to the CIB and looking around and saying, look, these are the blokes I read about in newspapers. They're the guys who, arrest all these dangerous offenders. As I said, I'd met Kelly. He was in charge of the hunt for Simmons and Newcomb, who had escaped from Emu Plains prison farm. And they, whilst they were escaping, they actually bashed to death one of the prison officers there. I think his name was Mills, with a baseball bat, and killed him. And so there was a massive manhunt, and they were all over the place. I can remember we were up at Jillaby, and we were out near the old showground here at Kensington. And but I can remember Ray being in charge, and he always appeared to be such a dynamic bloke when I saw him. And he was certainly dynamic that day at that meeting. And I thought, well, I'll try and be like him if I ever get the chance.
Do you remember the sort of things he was asking you? Like, could you say, I remember him saying to me X, Y, and Z, and I remember saying that sort of stuff, or is it too long ago?
Neil, off the record, I wouldn't be going to tell you exactly what he suggested I had to be good at to be a detective. You know what I mean? Yeah. It was one of the hidden secrets. Yeah. No, Ray Kelly asked me questions, about my local knowledge of criminals in the area, He mentioned names to me, and he asked me to mention some names who were on the wanted list. They were the safe man then he was the arch criminal. Armed robberies hadn't quite taken on the role that they took on later. But the safe man, you had to know who these safe men were and the cars they drove and where they lived, because they were on special lists, and because they were always out at night knocking safes off. They knocked off hotel safes. Chemist shops were hit regularly. Butcher shops. Butchers were known to have heaps of black money, so they were all targets for these very clever safe men. They were the ace criminals, and they were referred to as tank men, and they were looked up to by other crims as the ace of criminality. Having spent about, I think it was about 6 months in plainclothes at Bankstown, and having fronted the bull ring and got a very high rating, I was transferred to 21 Division. 21 Division had been formed after the Second World War, because we had all these soldiers who'd come back. They were all probably suffering from post-traumatic stress, but that was a phrase that no one had invented back in those days. And a lot of these guys were alcoholics. They'd seen so much violence and whatever, and they were out of control. So they formed this squad to control the streets, and they kept it going for years and years. But it was also a training ground for detectives, young detectives like myself. So having been there only a very short space of time, a murder had happened out in Allison Road, Randwick, where a bloke named Pretty Boy Robert Walker, he had an altercation with some heavier crims and let a few shots go and caused a bit of drama. And anyhow, suddenly this day he was walking down Allison Road at Randwick, almost opposite the old Labor Club there, and suddenly it was a 1960 model Holden just came down Allison Road from Avoca Street, slowed to a stop. A machine gun was pointed out the window, or was passed out the window and held out the window. A heap of shots were fired from this machine gun, and of course he was blown to death or killed, shot by numerous shots from this machine gun, and of course was dead on the footpath. Now, 2 CIB detectives were sent out to Randwick Police Station to work on the case. Jack McNeil was then a sergeant on the homicide squad, or the special crime squad, as it was later called. He was sent out there with Phil Arance. And then I got a call, or I got called into the boss's office at 21 Division to say that he was sending me and another guy out to Randwick to assist the detectives there in this investigation. Well, I was really wrapped in that, because I thought this is something I can really get my teeth into. So we were given a car and we went out to Randwick, and very fortunate for me was the fact that Jack McNeil grabbed me as his workmate, because I was in a fairly good shorthand writer and typist, and he gave the other guy to Phil Arance. I later found out, of course, that Jack and Phil Arance never got on. They were on different wavelengths as detectives, and because that's another story. But it was an unbelievable experience for me, because Jack was he was then a mid-ranking detective sergeant, very experienced, and here I was, a very junior plainclothes bloke, working with him and interviewing criminals and suspects and learning how to put a running sheet together, and basically learning the rudiments of how to run a murder investigation. And to me, it was just an unbelievable experience. Now, unfortunately, the case wasn't solved. It's a fact of life that Ray Kelly had many, many informers. And Ray was actually the overall boss of it, by the way. Ray was the detective inspector sent out from the CIB to oversee the whole operation, but it was Jack McNeil. He was the active detective sergeant doing all the investigative work. But Ray Kelly had promised Jack and the local detectives that he would have this case solved, that he would have the information that would lead to the rest of these 2 guys. Now, something happened in the meantime. I knew later on, or during the investigation, that Lenny McPherson was the bloke who was actually supplying the information to Ray Kelly. It was quite a strange coincidence to me. I thought at the time, well, It's funny, the day that Robert Walker got machine gunned on Allison Road, Lenny McPherson happened to be getting married that day. Whether it was a coincidence, I'm sure it was. But that was his alibi. So the two blokes who did it, one was a guy named Raymond Patrick Terence O'Connor, Ducky O'Connor, who was shot to death in the Latin Quarter, not that long after, not that many years after. And the other guy who they nominated, I've always had my doubts as to whether he had anything to do with it, so I won't mention his name. But this was a perfect example of where we knew who basically had done it, but were never able to prove it with enough evidence. But it was really a great, it was a great experience for Roger for later on in life.
Picks me up with a bag of tricks. Yes, she's given me a grand tour around King's Cross.
We all had a fascination for King's Cross, and I went there as a young bloke. I went there working there as a policeman. I'd also go up there with my friends off duty because we all liked the place. You never knew what was going to happen on the streets of King's Cross, but it was still a fun place to go to. I think it still is a fun place to go to.
Says it can be a good life. It's not as sleazy as you think.
Talking about trawling the crossing, one of these things was would have been in 1960 when I was doing weekend vice squad duty with the vice squad detectives who were then stationed at Darlinghurst. We used to have to report for duty at 5 o'clock, rather 4 o'clock on the Friday afternoon. So being at at Darlinghurst, I drove a little Volkswagen in, and then we'd find a spot around back of 4th Street there, around behind the Tech, the old jail. And then a report in the back lane to the vice squad. There was Harry Giles. There were a heap of blokes there, a heap of, I think, I'm trying to think of Jack Stinson was one of the other detectives. And then they'd have complaints about brothels, they'd have complaints about SP betting, they'd have complaints about hoodlums and whatever. Then they'd plan the night, the sergeants, and off we'd go. They had one of these paddy wagons, a plain one, no signs or anything on it, and then they had they had cars, and then but we'd use these to trawl up through the cross, and then we'd also use it to go down to where all the brothels were, down in East Sydney, near Liverpool Street, Burnell Place, Woods Lane. The cross was a lot different to what it is today. The cross had no drugs as we know today. You never saw a prostitute who was stoned out of her eyes or stoned out of her body. We had a bit of marijuana around the place. The prostitutes were they were good-looking girls. They worked in the brothels, which in this sort of an unofficial area down in East Sydney. They didn't work up the streets here. You never saw a prostitute on Darlinghurst Road where we are now. That was forbidden. A few used to work in William Street and they used to get pinched. They didn't like them working on William Street. The girls liked it for some reason. Maybe it was passing traffic. But as I said, most of the girls worked in the brothels. Now, when they changed the law and closed them down, well then, of course, it put all the girls back out on the streets. There'd be certain places that had to be knocked off, and we'd go to those premises, sometimes with a warrant, mainly not with a warrant, and there were certain girls who had been previously locked up for, stopping men for immoral purposes, and they wouldn't have gone to court. They would have not gone to court to answer their bail conditions. So then they'd be fined in absentia, and then there'd be a warrant for their arrest. So we might end up pinching 4 or 5 or 6 or sometimes more girls that basically hadn't paid fines or hadn't appeared in court. So then we'd have other girls that they'd pinch for prostitution. They might be working in the wrong area. That, as I said, on William Street. It was sort of, as I said before, it was organised. If you wanted to fit into the plan that, which the government allowed to happen, and I can only say the government had to be part of it, because as a young bloke, and especially a little bit later on when I was at the CIB, I'd run into politicians. I knew the local politicians from who represented King's Cross and Darlinghurst. Albie Sloss was one of them. And they were pretty decent blokes. Yeah, that's right. And so the whole thing must have been pretty well organised. It couldn't have been done at the lower level of the police department, because otherwise it would have blown up. The way I saw it, and talking to these older cops, blokes who were then detective sergeants, I suppose they would have been in their 40s and 50s, and maybe had 16 to 20 years service, 15 to 20 years service. It all seemed to be the status quo, which allowed things to happen the way they did, and everyone seemed to be happy. And I was just a young bloke. I was no crusader. I could see nothing wrong with how things ran back in those days. Now, whether they were illegal or improper or organised or other, I don't know. But all I know is that I compare those years, those days, with what happens today, and it seems to be that there's complete antagonism between the police and everybody else on the street, from the owners of hotels, publicans, down to idiots on the street that they're trying to keep under control. And I don't see it works that well. I mean, it must be horrible to, I think, to be a copper today and not knowing and when your next black eye is going to come, or when you're going to get assaulted, because it seems to be the police attitude is it's them against the rest of the world. They have this siege mentality. Everybody hates them. I don't see how it works as well as the old system. Now, of course, the old system will never come back, because there would not be a politician or a senior police officer in the world these days to say, well, let's go back to the old system and try it out.
You must have had some good times up here.
Had some fantastic times.
Few drinks.
Oh yeah. The Mayfair was the main hotel we drank at. It was a pub that actually was where just near the coach sign is, an old hotel, long gone. And you'd go in there. You had to know the doorman. Well, being police officer didn't matter much. Our badge got us in. How are you, mate?
What's with all the cameras, champ?
We're doing a bit of filming.
We're doing a bit of filming up here, mate.
A documentary.
Yeah.
Very nice. Your name wouldn't be Roger, would it?
It is.
Oh, good stuff.
How are you, mate?
Good, mate.
What's your name?
Daniel, champ.
How are you, Daniel? Roger Rogerson. We're doing a doco,
Yeah.
in the old paddy wagon. You like it?
Yeah, it's nice.
Hey, I used to drive
We
around one
thought,
of
we
these.
thought it was either a paddy wagon
Hey?
or it was a Google Earth street view crew. Back in the day.
So what are you doing in here fucking us up?
Just
You realise
get this off, mate.
you're interfering with the police here?
Former police. So.
Doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
I'm still a shithead when I want to be. All right, right.
Yeah.
See you later,
Thanks, mate.
Al. Alex.
Look amazing, isn't it? Wouldn't be Roger Rogerson, would you?
Yeah, she's giving me a grand tour around the cross.
Every interstate detective, whoever comes to Sydney, always wants to go to King's Cross. And of course we felt it was our duty to bring them up here, and of course we had a good liaison with Bernie Houghton at the Bourbon and Beefsteak and in the Texas Tavern days when he owned it. Every place at the Cross the police were welcome in. We used to keep them under control. We kept the hoodlums under control. We kept the salt and robs down, and it was a pretty happy place all round. And yeah, we've had. It was a really terrific place. Everyone enjoyed themselves. We Lay Girls, which was just down the road a bit there.
Was that one of Abe Saffron's?
It was one of Abe's. I knew Abe Saffron, of course, well from those early days when I worked on the Vice Squad, because we would be up and around the place, and being inquisitive young bloke as I was, and I ran into him on a few occasions, and he introduced himself to me and vice versa. I found him a bloke that always did exactly what the police asked of him, and I heard very few blokes ever have a complaint about it. 90% of the detectives, the senior detectives who are a lot senior to me, all, spoke highly of Abe, that if there was a problem with one of Abe's premises or a problem with one of Abe's employees, if the employee had stepped out of line, maybe someone had been assaulted or someone had probably been robbed or ripped off or something, you only had to talk to Abe, and the guy would be surrendered to you, and everything would, if there was money stolen, it would be reimbursed. Everyone was left happy. There was never a problem with it. He wanted to. I honestly believe that Abe Saffron was probably 30 years ahead of his time, in that when he kicked off these nightclubs, we had 6 o'clock closing. We had almost prohibition, after 6 o'clock to try and get a beer. We had no such thing as a nightclub licence, no such thing as a entertainment licence, and yet people, the Americans, American servicemen who were here, during the war, and then after the war, people from overseas expected these facilities to be legal, expecting them to be here. Well, they would go to these premises, be they Abe's places, or like the old Latin Quarter, or like the old Checkers. Checkers never had a licence. Never had a licence. It had a restaurant licence, but it certainly never had a nightclub licence. There was no such thing. So people would go to these places, business people, good people, wealthy people. They would go to these places expecting them to be licensed. They never realised it. None of them were. There was no such thing. But I think, from my knowledge of how things worked back in those days, you had the government, they were worried about religious vote, which was a religious vote, which was then very important and a big part of the vote, and it was sort of hidden from the public. Now, you can say, oh, that's bad, but 90% of the public, it didn't mean anything to them anyhow, because they never came to King's Cross. The people who are in the know, if you wanted to put a bet on, or play roulette, or play blackjack, or play cards, you knew where to go, because you were local.
So the politicians of the day knew exactly what was going on.
I would be absolutely for certain that the local politicians here, such as old Albie Sloss, would have known exactly what was happening around their area, because they would have known all the operators of these places. And no doubt the operators weighed in to the party, both, I suppose, Labor and Liberal. It was a very big surprise when Bob Askin got voted in as a Liberal Premier, and everyone thought things would be different. Now, all right, Bob loved a punt and a bet, and I know the media have hammered him as this very, very corrupt Premier. I think that is 100% fucking bullshit. There's been premiers here a lot more corrupt than old Bob Askin. Bob liked a punt and a bet, and that was about the height of it. But he didn't organise things like other premiers have done, to organise contracts so companies owned by that person would be given government work. That was well and truly above Bob's limitations. But he let things run, and I think it was a great idea. As I said, if you're in the know and wanted to have a bet, or knew where to have a bet, or go and have a gamble at night, then you knew where to go to. And the places were well run. The police kept them under control. There were no idiots allowed in the places. To me, as I said earlier, to me, if that's organised crime, to me that seems a better system than disorganised crime, which appears to be the state of the poll today.
Did you ever meet Askin?
I met Askin. I went to a function one night and he was there. It was a ball, and it was just a normal ball, and he was there. He seemed to like talking to police officers. Later on, I got to know well, he's a retired superintendent now, but he'd been working in the Manly area all his life as a detective, and then as a superintendent, inspector, etc. And he was a very good friend of his. And this guy says, mate, there was no better bloke than Bob. He said, if you had a problem, you'd go and see him. Bob would drink at the Stay-In Hotel on a Saturday morning. All his constituents could meet him there, have a beer with him during the morning, and if you had a problem, he'd sort it out with you, or he'd sort it out for them. You can't do that today, I'm sure. Leonard Arthur McPherson, known as Mr. Big. I had heard of him back in the early 60s when I was a very junior plainclothes person. And I got to know Lenny later in life myself. Look, the way we used to work back in those days, you were successful if you had informers who told you what was happening. I know the whole system's changed today and they use bugging devices and that sort of thing. We didn't have any of those facilities. If you had informers, you were a successful detective. Later on in life, I saw where Ray Kelly handed Lenny McPherson down. I mean, it's not a matter of like some formal handing over, but my workmate, Noel Morey, became very close to Len. And of course I became close to Len because I was Noel's workmate. Now, digressing somewhat, but many years later, when Noel and I were working together, and we were working together on the Whiskey A Go-Go case up in Brisbane, we relied heavily on Lenny McPherson because we needed him and other criminals to come to Brisbane at the trial of John Andrew Stewart and Jimmy Finch to say, well, only to tell the truth, but to say that they were not involved with some standover racket in Brisbane. Now, had we not had this ability or this arrangement with them where we could communicate and we had a trust for each other, had these guys just refused to come, the case would have probably fallen apart up in Brisbane. So that's another reason why it was so important to have people like Lenny McPherson where we could communicate with and we had a trust for each other. So Lenny McPherson, as I said, known as Mr. Big, and what died maybe 10 years ago now in, I think in prison up at Cessnock.
Was it a shock to you that Lenny McPherson was informing?
It was a shock to me at the time when I realised that Lenny McPherson was an informer. Ray Kelly used to write his diary up at the time, and we all wrote diaries as detectives, and we found at Randwick Police Station where Ray Kelly used to hide his diary. So being inquisitive young detectives, we used to look at it. And there we saw these entries where it was on duty at the CIB and out to Randwick Police Station and blah, 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 attending a running sheet, spoke to Detective Sergeant McNeil, other police involved. Received a phone call from Mr. Prince at such and such a time, went to the Oceanic Hotel, saw Mr. Prince, said he was still having trouble getting the information that we needed. Well, of course, Mr. Prince was Leonard Arthur McPherson. And of course, it was a lesson to me that this is how these cases are solved, or were solved.
How did it practically, and did he live on Prince something Street, or what was he called Mr. Prince for a reason?
Leonard Arthur Macpherson lived in Prince Edward Street, Gladesville. Now, whether Mr. Prince and Prince Edward, probably there would be some connection between the two.
And you're talking about how it worked and how detectives passed on people like Lenny. Tell me, where did Lenny come from in terms of police, and what's the first time you meet him in that sense as he's being passed on to you?
Later on, when I was actually working at the Special Crime Squad myself, which was the forerunner of the Homicide Squad, working with Noel Morey, I had many meetings with Lenny Macpherson, very surreptitious meetings, and Len, it was like running a business. Len's name was used by people who didn't even know him. He was used by club owners to. His name was used by club owners to keep other junior thugs from trying to stand over them. And I'm not talking about big illegal gambling clubs. I'm talking about in the 60s and 70s, we had ethnic clubs everywhere in the inner suburbs, Five Dock, Leichhardt, and and these ethnic people, they liked playing cards and they liked playing their games. And of course they were really exposed to being abused by mugs who could easily just walk in and tip over tables and demand money. And if they weren't paid, then they'd be back and they'd wreck the bloody joint. And so of course people use Lenny's name, and Lenny and his group, they realised that. And Lenny, they kept the place clean, and they stopped these little, well, let's put it this way. Lenny was always known as Mr. Big, and I think he was entitled to that name. But unfortunately, we had a lot of little Mr. Bigs who all wanted to become Mr. Bigs, and of course the place wasn't big enough for them, and they didn't know how to behave themselves, so they never became Mr. Bigs. They remained little Mr. Bigs until the police took over, and then they just went back to where they should be, and that was not being little Mr. Biggs even at any sort of level. So Lenny, so this is how Lenny sort of became so much involved, and you could call it. It wasn't. He didn't stand over anybody. Len never had to stand over anybody. People were very, very happy. These proprietors of these little clubs, and even the bigger places, were happy to have Len come along, show his face, because it kept all these other dickheads in place. And that's how it worked. Now, I remember recently talking to someone and they said, well, you know, wasn't that organised crime? And I said, well, it probably would have been, well, yes, you could call it organised crime, but I think that form of organised crime is far better than the disorganised crime we have today, where we have gangs of youths, of louts, of all ethnic descriptions, just doing what they like, and just going into hotels and clubs and wrecking places, firing guns, injuring people, shooting people, and that's completely, you know, it's completely out of hand. Now, in those days, the likes of Lenny Macpherson kept those people under control, and the police helped him do it, and he helped the police do it.
You said you had surreptitious meetings with him. I mean, tell me what you mean by that. I mean, we're in a pub now. Did you meet in pubs? Did you have a couple, you know, one schooner or 20? Or give me a flavour of how it actually worked. Where you would meet him?
We would ring Len up and we'd say, we need to meet you, and we would always meet somewhere. It'd be a pub, mainly a pub. It could be sometimes would be very late at night. I've met Lenny as late as 2 or 3 in the morning, up round the back of the cross, some little joint that where we knew that no one would have seen him coming and going, or ourselves, or we would go in the back way, and we met under those circumstances. We had to protect him, of course, and because he as I said earlier, I mean, I was surprised when I realised that he was an informer. And then I realised that, yes, there wasn't only Lenny as an informer, I had dozens of informers later in life. And that's why I was successful in making so many arrests, because of the information I was receiving. So you always met these people where they were protected themselves from anyone seeing them with you. Now, we never trusted phones. Back in those days, even though phone tapping was illegal, it was still being done. I know the New South Wales Police admitted later on at one of the Royal Commissions that they had been doing it, and I knew that the feds were doing it, and because the feds back in those days, they were just jealous of the New South Wales Police, and they would love to catch someone like myself talking to someone like Lenny on the phone just to cause harm and just to cause trouble for you. In the early 60s, the drug squad consisted of 4 guys. And then they increased it by 8, by another 4 to 8, because I was asked by Seth Abbott, who later became the police commissioner, to join the drug squad, and it didn't sort of suit me, that sort of work, and I never joined it. So I went from 4 to 8 because there's been a slight increase in marijuana and maybe a little bit of heroin. Well then, with the R&R, of course, we then had a huge influx of heroin. Of course, we still had the Chinese with their little opium dens, but with the Americans firmly established in the cross in the R&R days, heroin really started to really flourish, or the heroin sales. The sales of heroin really flourished.
Take me through some of the strip clubs and what they were like in those days. What some of the names? We've got the Pink Pussycat, I think Paradise Club. Just run me through some of the names and what they were like.
Back in those days, we always had strip clubs. Of course, our laws in regard to girls taking all their clothes off were very strict back in those days, and they used to wear little tassels over their nipples and little panties. But they were very titillating, and we used to go along and watch them. But I can remember one of the bigger clubs that opened up was the Paradise Club, and that was opened up by a bloke named Leon LeSurf. He'd actually been a safe breaker, a pretty well-known safe breaker, and decided to turn over a new leaf, and he opened up this strip club, the Paradise Club. It was a great place. And it had some well-known people that used to go to it. And then, of course, we had the Venus Room. Now, the Venus Room was owned by Abe Saffron. Peter Farr was in partnership with him. And, of course, we had Jimmy Anderson, the famous James McCartney Anderson. And he basically started running all these strip places. That the premises were owned or rented by Abe and Peter Farr, or Peter Farrugia. And then Jim Anderson became their manager and ran all these joints. They were little places. Some had licences, some didn't. It just depended on the size of the premises. But they were pretty well run. There was pretty good liaison between the joints and the police, and things were kept under control. Assault and robberies were kept down to the minimum, that could be possibly to happen. And as I said, they were pretty well run. The cost was fairly tidy back in those days.
Tell me a little bit about Jimmy Anderson, because he was a Scotsman. He was fairly robust sort of bloke. At one stage, he has a run-in with a bloke called Donnie Smith, wasn't he?
Well, Jim Anderson, of course, he later turned on his boss, Abe Saffron, gave evidence against Abe Saffron over a tax matter. But back in those days, he fancied himself as a very strong man. He was a Scotsman, fancied himself as being a bit of a knuckle man. And I remember being up at the cross. I didn't actually work on the case, but I was up there on the night where Jim Anderson had a run-in with a guy who was known as the Glove. Donnie Smith was his name. He was a knock-around, stand-over man. He used to love getting into these places and showing off. And he had a bit of a run-in with Jim Anderson, and he belted Jim Anderson, and then he left the premises, and Jim thought that he was going to get a gun to come back and shoot at Jim. So Jim was licensed and produced a firearm and actually shot him in the middle of the street, killed him.
And
What was Bernie Houghton like? What was he? You know, take me a little bit of a picture of him.
Now, Bernie Houghton, of course, as I said before, was he had connections with the American military and the CIA, and openly talked about it. He basically made Sydney his home. He, as I said, having established the bourbon and beefsteak, he opened another place actually down at Circular Quay called Harpoon Harry's. And it was another great big place where all the American servicemen frequented, but it burnt down. I don't know what caused the fire, but it certainly burnt down, and they never re-established it. But Bernie basically lived out of the bourbon. The bourbon expanded. I mean, the bourbon, when it was sold, it was on about 20 or 30 different titles. And I know it was a big problem for the new owners to convert all these titles into one title so they could redevelop it as the bourbon is now known.
With the sly grog and the illegal gambling, the little joints, did the cops turn a blind eye? Was that sort of sanctioned? Tell me how that all worked.
Everybody who wanted to gamble knew where to go and gamble. Now we had as they're now called, illegal casinos. These were places that had existed for years. We had the Forbes Club in Forbes Street, not hard to find. We had the 33 Club in Oxford Street. We had the Goulburn Club in Goulburn Street. But people who never bet and never had any interest in betting or gambling, they basically didn't know they existed, and they operated. And the uniformed police back in those days, they looked after the street crime. You had the Vice Squad that looked after vice and prostitution. You had the Drug Squad that looked after the druggies on the street and drug distribution. And then, of course, you had the Gaming Squad, which was formed after 21 Division was abandoned. And it concentrated on these gaming houses. Now, there had to be some arrangement where these places operated. And I think the only time when they did something, the police really acted on them, was when there were complaints. And of course, with the media getting more powerful over the years, and the media continually complained, of course, and they finally closed them down. And of course, by that point of time, we had licensed, we had a TAB. You know, I can remember working around the cross and working in all the suburbs of Sydney on this weekend Vice Squad work. We had SP bookmaking businesses everywhere, but they were part of the culture at the time. They were part of the fabric. People who wanted to have a bet, who couldn't, get a train in from Toongabbie or Seven Hills to Randwick Racecourse or Rose Hill, they'd go to their local SP and have a bet there. And some of them were little running places. It was the same at the cross. They were little running places. There were certain hotels that had SP. But of course, then the time came when the TAB was established. The government realised they were missing out on a lot of money, so they licensed the TABs. They set up the TAB run by the government, and of course, then all the SP agencies had to be closed down, and they were by the police. The police did what they were told by the government, and they went and closed them all down.
How's the cross changed in terms of strip clubs and drugs and all that from when you first went up there to now, do you think?
Well, the King's Cross has changed dramatically. We've got a lot of clubs now, but I'm told now they're licensed. We hear about John Ibrahim having a connection with all these clubs. I knew John Ibrahim from a 15-year-old boy. I always knew he was very smart and miles smarter than all the other people of his vintage and doing the same thing. And from what I read, I mean that we now have very, very upmarket places where people go to. Red-blooded blokes like myself, we've always loved looking at girls, and originally we had to look at them with not all their clothes off, and over the years they've changed these laws so that they take everything off now, and we're still looking at them and enjoying it. And it's always had that attraction, the cross. And of course, there are a lot of strip joints up there now, but I think they're pretty well controlled, and I suppose they supply a service for blokes like me who like looking at girls with no clothes on.
Tell me about the murder you covered up there. What were the circumstances? The name, the circumstances, what happened?
One of the murders I did work on up the cross was a woman named Helen Pornovich, and she was shot dead in the middle of Kellett Street, which runs off Bayswater Road, just up from Darlinghurst Road, on New Year's Eve in 1967. Now, it seems a long time ago, but she'd got involved with a gang of guys who were doing armed robberies, and she'd borrowed a bit of money off them, and when they asked her to pay the money back, she said no, that she knew all about them, and she was basically starting to blackmail them. So they decided to get rid of her, and they met her in Eve's Coffee Lounge, which is a little coffee shop, a little coffee lounge just round the corner in Kellett Street. And they met her, and she refused to pay them the money. And just about right at midnight, one of the guys, Alan Dillon, I remember when we interviewed him, he said, I gave her the kiss of death and wished her Happy New Year, but that actually was a kiss of death when I wished her Happy New Year. She left the coffee shop, walked across the road, and one of their cohorts was waiting in a phone box, which was right outside the Mansions Hotel, and he just stepped out from the phone box, and with a .22 rifle, he shot her 3 times and killed her instantly. Now, that rifle was later matched up where it had been fired in a number of bank hold-ups ballistically, and these guys were eventually charged with all those armed robberies. We charged them with the murder of Helen Pornovich, and they were convicted about a year or so later and all got life. In late 1968, these guys were convicted of the murder, but during the murder investigation, my workmate and myself, we knew that we were there the next morning after the murder. And so we went to the media and all the newspapers. We had the morning newspapers, the Herald and the Telly, and then we had the Sun and the Mirror. So we went to the 4 newspapers, and they'd all had photographers there. Anyhow, they gave us the pictures that they'd taken of the street scene. And down from the phone box where this guy stepped out and shot her, there was a picture of they'd taken a street photo, and here was this big Pontiac, NPT 400, I think was the number. It was Queensland number plate. It was a big Pontiac Parisian. And that turned out to be Fred Harbecker's car. He'd bought it in Queensland. They'd done an armed robbery up there. He'd bought this car in a bodgy name, and they'd arrived there in the Pontiac and then left. They couldn't get it out. It was jammed in. So they'd left the scene after they'd shot this woman dead. And so we used that picture, and we could prove the connection through identification of this car being owned by Fred Harbecker. And when the whole thing was over, the Mirror, I think it was the Mirror newspaper photograph depicting this car. Bill Jenkins, who was a well-known crime journalist, police roundsman. Bill wrote a story on the front page of the Mirror, basically saying the Mirror had solved this crime because they'd had this picture of the car owned by the murderer, which they'd handed to the police. So we gave them the credit because it certainly assisted in convicting these arseholes. But that was just one of the things that happened in the cross. As I said, you never knew what was going to happen on the streets of King's Cross, but it was still a fun place to go to. I think it still is a fun place to go to. I first heard the name Ned Smith, or Arthur Stanley Smith, which is his correct name, when we had them identified, he and a guy named Robert Chapman, for Fielder's Bakery. It was an attempted armed robbery on Fielder's Bakery. It was a payroll robbery out at Granville. When 2 of the staff from Fielder's Bakery went to the bank to collect the payroll, and Bobby Chapman and Neddy Smith were there waiting to rob them. And the guys from Fielder's Bakery were pretty plucky, pretty brave, and they actually got into their car and got going. And one or the other, Ned or Bobby Chapman, we never could work out who, and there was all sorts of information came in later about who did it or who didn't. But one of them fired a shot, which somehow lodged between the back edge of the front door and the front edge of the back door of the offside of the car. Heaven knows how the bullet landed there, otherwise it had been an inch further forward or backward. It would have obviously hit the driver in the head and probably killed him. So they were basically wanted for attempted murder as well as just attempted armed robbery. And we had them identified, and it was then a matter of trying to find them. Originally, I arrested Bobby Chapman. We got him out at Abbots in the Abbotsford district, and he admitted his involvement, and he subsequently pleaded guilty and got 13.5 years. Now, Bobby Chapman and Neddy Smith, of course, had been in boys' homes together, and they'd both also served fairly long sentences for rape. They raped a girl, and I think they were charged at Petersham with that. Now, they'd done 7 or 8 years for that, so they were pretty closely involved as young blokes, and of course, as mates. Bobby Chapman's wife was apparently in on the job. She was charged with accessory, but she never went to jail. We then had to find Ned Smith. Ned wasn't at his usual haunts. Now, we're now in the Iron Duke Hotel, of course, and this is right in the middle of Alexandria. And this was basically where Neddy grew up as a kid. He grew up in the Redfern, Alexandria area, and basically frequented it all his life until he, of course, he was arrested, and he's been frequenting Long Bay ever since. But up until that point, of course, this was his favourite little area. Now, of course, what happened was that we found out that Ned was reporting on some minor charge at Rockdale Police Station. It wasn't really our plan to arrest him there, but we had to do it there because we couldn't find him in any of the normal locations where we expected him to be. So a team of armed whole squad blokes, including myself, but I was more on the periphery this time because I had the Chapman brief. We waited at Rockdale Police Station, and of course he fronted in to report this particular Saturday afternoon, and he was promptly arrested by Brian Harding and John Burke. And of course his wife Deborah was there. He organised a solicitor to be there in no time. Ned made no admissions, and eventually the case against Ned collapsed. Now, after Ned was arrested and he was on bail, I had a few very strong criminal contacts that I used as informers. One of these guys contacted me and told me that someone wanted to meet me and talk to me. So he arranged a meeting, and of course he turned up with Ned Smith. And from that moment on, I agreed that I would, if he had something to talk about, or I could assist him, if he was assisting us, then I was quite happy to talk to him. That's how our relationship first kicked off, going back all those years. Now, as I said, he failed as an armed robber back in those days, obviously, but he beat the charge, and then he then got involved heavily into drugs. And notwithstanding he could inform to me, I mean, certainly he wasn't informing to everyone in the police, and there was no such things as green light as has been often talked about, especially back in those days. And if you might recall, or we recall, that the BCI guys had a huge brief against him for importing drugs. And that all stemmed, of course, from the fact that he was the brother-in-law of Paul Haywood, of Haywood Fellows and Sinclair fame, who, of course, were all arrested over there in Bangkok and served long sentences. Haywood, of course, is dead today. He became a junkie, a heroin addict himself, and died. But Ned, of course, was then using his brother-in-law, who was openly going across to Thailand and just walking straight back through customs with a suitcase full of heroin, pure heroin. And in no time at all, Ned was skiding to the world that he was a millionaire from the heroin dealing.
Take me back to that meeting. Do you remember where that meeting was by any chance, that very first meeting with Ned?
This meeting that this criminal associate of mine had, or criminal contact of mine had set up, took place actually at a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown. And I mean, I was happy because the way we succeeded in solving crime was to be able to talk to people and obtain information from them. And of course, Ned was the perfect tool to be used for that purpose, because he was a young bloke then. He was a very jealous fellow, but he was looked up to because of his size and his stamina. And no one, of course, would ever have dreamed that Ned was, in fact, an informer.
This is going to sound like a stupid question, but why? What made him a good informer? I mean, I presume he'd been in jail, he knew lots of people. I don't know, just you tell me that.
I think the reason that Ned wanted to be an informer was he, of course, at this point he hadn't beaten the Fielders Bakery charge. And no doubt in his own mind, probably knew he'd done it. And he'd be thinking in the back of his mind, well, the cops must have evidence somewhere. Probably I'll be convicted. I think he just wanted insurance. And I think that, well, I know that he and Bobby Chapman certainly didn't like going to jail, although he's had a good dose this last time. But this happens with people. I mean, they just want, they become informants for whatever reason, I don't know.
Where would you meet Ned? Would you meet for a beer or a morning, afternoon, late night? Give me a bit of a...
Ned would ring me up, be it at the Hold-Up Squad or later on when I went to Darlinghurst, and he would always be at a pub in this area. Here at the Iron Duke, the Star Hotel, which is long gone, was one of his other drinking holes, the Cauliflower Hotel, the Fitzroy just down the road, the Glenroy, I think it's the Glenroy. This was his area. He knew this area backwards because he'd grown up here as a kid. And he'd ring up and I'd meet him for a beer. If we were working on a particular case, I'd bring whoever I was working with me. They would have met Ned at the same time. Sometimes Ned was with other people, such as Glenn Flack or Graham Henry. In fact, I suppose the biggest meeting I ever had with Ned, which he organised, was the one to try and settle down the fighting and infighting that was going on between himself and his group and Christopher Flannery, when Chris was on bail on this murder charge in Sydney. And of course they were, they were sniping at each other, and of course people were, their associates weren't helping. They were saying, oh, Chris, Ned's going to get you, and they'd be telling Chris that, or rather Ned, that Chris is going to get you. So that was my job. You're supposed to be there. The policeman's job is to keep the peace and keep bloodshed down to a minimum. And that was a meeting organised in the city pub.
Do you remember specifically meeting Ned in here and what that was about, or broadly what it was about? And I mean, would you just pop in for 1 or 2 beers, or would you have a knock off a few schooners?
Look, sometimes I might be in a hurry. It might be during the day. I'd probably have 3 or 4 beers with him, and he'd tell me what he wanted to tell me. Sometimes, maybe in the evening going home, I'd probably, if he'd have rung up, I'd have had a few more. But it was always, I always made a record, and my superiors always knew every time I caught up with Ned.
And what sort of bloke was he? Was he, I don't know, well, he was big. Was he good with his fists? Was he smart? Was he a thinker? Or did he just sort of use his fists to sort things out? Paint me a bit of a picture of Ned.
Neddy was, I suppose you could describe him as an enigma. He was a very big man, very strong. He was just a natural street fighter. He trained on schooners of beer. Other blokes would be going to the gym, but he'd just train on beer. And he seemed to be always fit. I never saw him sort of being overweight. He had a good sense of humour. Women loved his company. He was, if there were, if he was in the presence of women and someone came in with selling those roses, he'd buy a heap of roses and present them to all the girls that were around the place. He was very, very charming, especially to the female sex. And basically it was good company. If you didn't know who he was, and you were sort of met him for the first time, you'd say, Christ, he's a nice bloke, lovely bloke to have a beer with, and very funny and clever, and I'd like to meet him again. Such a nice, pleasant bloke to have a beer with.
How useful was he to you over the years in terms of information? Did he get good information?
I can only stand on my record as a detective at the time, all those years ago, and I made numerous arrests I was at the armed robbery squad, armed hold-up squad, and our job was to lock up armed robbers, violent criminals. That's what an armed robbery is. And we were very successful. And I say I was particularly successful myself, and I only was successful because of my ability to obtain information, which of course led to evidence. And it wasn't only Ned, but Ned played a very prominent part in me collecting or gathering information which I passed on to other members of the armed hold-up squad, which led to numerous arrests. Ned, unfortunately, we talked about him being such a charming fellow, but unfortunately on the other side of him, the devious side, he was a very jealous man, very jealous, and he was jealous of anyone he thought who was maybe doing better than he was. And made no qualms about talking about them, and was very happy to basically give them up,
This is how it worked. There were informers, you met them in pubs. Take me through that because, yeah.
Ned Smith, of course, was one, as I've already said, one of many informers that I had. You wonder why someone would want to be an informer, and for their own reason, whether it's a security blanket type thing that they think they can rely on. But it's a pretty hard, dangerous old world out there. Without those people supplying information, the police couldn't do their job. Maybe it's changed today because they now have phone tapping powers and listening device powers, which we never had. Had we had a lot of those powers, maybe we would have been even more successful. But they came later on in life, of course. But, you know, it is a hard, old, horrible world. We don't live in a utopia. And this is how things happen. This is the real world, the real criminal world at work. I don't have any regrets about what I did. As I said, I stand on my reputation. I know for many, many years I had more commendations for bravery and good policemanship, resulting in arrests of people, than most other detectives, and I was very proud of that. But of course it didn't help me much later in life.
What do you say to his allegations that he paid you a lot of money? And I can't remember what he says in his book, Roger, but he basically says he paid you bribes and all that sort of stuff. What do you say to that?
Ned Smith, of course, in his books has made allegations that I was a corrupt cop, that it was just a bit of a party the whole time. Blue Murder sort of depicts us as always on the piss, eating Chinese food, playing a piano somewhere, burying my ass in a pub somewhere on top of a bar, all having a great time. I say to people, had I been that busy doing that with Ned and just being involved in corruption, how was I able to win all the awards that I won for commendations for, you might say, well, I'd say brilliant policemanship, but you say good policemanship, for bravery. How did I win all these things? I mean, it was an impossibility to be doing the two things. Now, where I can trip Ned right up is in this way. Ned says, and so does Abbo Henry in his book, that Ned gave false evidence at the Warrenland Francie inquest. And that was held in October, November 1981. And he said, as a result of giving this evidence that he gave, which was false, he was immediately given the green light by Roger Rogerson and Brian Harding. And we sent him on an overseas trip and sent Deborah with him, and they had a nice party, and then he came back and he started to use the green light. Now, you go to their own works, their own writing. I left the police force. I was sacked in April 1986, but I was suspended basically from the 30th of November 1984. That was my last day of service, and I never came back to work after that. I had one day at Bankstown and went off on sick leave, stress leave, and never came back. And then they charged me with these departmental charges. Now, in that time, Neddy and Abbo were deeply involved in drug dealing, obviously. Abbo himself nearly got killed over at North Sydney. The drug squad ambushed him over there. He admits himself he had ½ a pound of heroin in his possession. But he says they positioned him to try and kill him, fired shots at the car, but he was lucky that he wasn't killed. Ned Smith was locked up by the Bureau of Criminal Intelligence, separate from us. That had nothing to do with me. I mean, Ned Smith openly skited that Paul Haywood, Haywood, Fellows and Sinclair, of that fame, Paul Haywood was actually Ned Smith's brother-in-law. He was married to Gail, who was Deborah's sister. Paul was the famous footballer, played for Newdown. Paul was going across to Thailand, and he come straight back through customs with a suitcase jam-packed with pure heroin. And of course the customs blokes knew him. "Oh, g'day Paul, how you going? Had another nice trip to Thailand?" "Yeah, mate, nothing to declare." No, straight through the customs, straight at the Ned's house in Henry Street, Sydenham. with millions of dollars worth of heroin. I was never, ever involved on the drug squad and always on the armed hold-up squad. Now, then in 1986, after I'm gone, they then started doing these large robberies, which they say is part of the green light. Why would you wait 5 years from 1981, which is factual, when the inquest occurred, when Ned said he got the green light? Why would you wait until 1986? I was no longer there. How could I help them then? Brian Harding had gone on to bigger and better things. It's a complete invention. It's absolute bullshit. Ned Smith has accused me of all these forms of corruption. Why wouldn't he? Here was a bloke who can only blame himself for getting caught. Got caught attempting to rob South Sydney Council payroll. In fact, the story is that a good friend of mine actually saw them hanging around outside the chambers, the town hall, and notified the police. And the next week they were there waiting for them. The police were there, and they caught them as they were about to rob take the payroll for the South Sydney Council workers. When Ned got charged over the stabbing murder of the tow truck guy down in Coogee Bay Road, Ned can only blame himself. But if you look at what he said, he blamed his then co-accused. He wouldn't name him, but he blamed him. Ned said, I didn't do it, the other bloke did. Wouldn't nominate him. What stuffed Ned in that case? Ned was 6'6" tall, the other bloke was about 5 foot tall. And of course there were witnesses who saw this. This happened at 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night. And the witnesses all gave statements to the police, said, well, it was the big guy who had the knife, not the little guy. So there again, Ned saying, no. Ned has got nothing left now. He always mouthed off. When he realised he was trapped and gone on that murder, Ned went to the Independent Commission Against Corruption. Mr Ian Temby thought he had a beauty on his hand. They had the Maloo inquiry. And of course, Ned went on with all his allegations, and they were supposed to be corroborated by Abbo. At the last minute, Abbo Henry refused to give evidence, and that gutted the ICAC investigation. But that didn't stop Temby from saying that I was corrupt and this person was corrupt and that, because that's how the ICAC is. They've got the power to make those findings without any evidence.
Just give me a succinct, your response to Ned Smith. He says he paid your money, you were corrupt, you did this, you did that. What's your, what do you want to say about him, mate? In a nutshell, I guess, Roger.
All I can say about Ned is that he's a broken man. He was a guy who was somebody in the criminal milieu, we might use that terminology, as ICAC did. He hates to think that any blame can be put on himself. I'm sure he blames me partly for being convicted over the tow truck stabbing. He blames everybody except himself. And in the end, he put all this malice and stuff that he had for everybody else, he piled on top of me, because he had nothing else to say about anybody else. And he knew he could say anything he liked about me, and I could do nothing about it. And that's it in a nutshell. The bloke has always had a very malicious tongue. It was a vicious personality. And when he realised that he had nothing left, couldn't help himself, he started tipping tons of shit on me. And that's the nature of the man. That's the nature of the man.
And what he was saying was false?
Everything he said about me is false. Everything he said about me is 100% false. Ned, there's a depiction in Blue Murder where we're having a barbecue in my backyard. This is after the Land Francie inquest, where we've given him the green light. It's in my backyard, my old house at Condell Park. I can assure you that Ned did not know where I lived. He did not know. He knew where my mother lived, in Stacey Street, because I met him there once. I was on holidays. I was actually working there. I was doing my mother's bathroom up. He'd never been to my home once, and he did not know where I lived. And as a matter of fact, back in those days, because we'd had some threats made on our lives, the police department changed our licences, the addresses on our licences, car registration, all that type of stuff, to a special address, so no one could track any of us down to our home addresses. And Ned was no different to the rest. He did not know where I lived.
And what was the point about that barbecue in your backyard? Just
Well, in Blue Murder, there's a scene where we are in my backyard having a barbie, and this is where I don't know who was there. I think it was Bill Duff, Brian Harding, all the characters playing all these guys. But Richard Roxburgh playing me, and we've given Ned the green light, and we've sent them on a cruise, and said, mate, you've got the green light, and everything's sweet, blah, blah, thanks very much. Now, as I said, he did not know where I lived. So he's made that up, or someone's made that up for the script of Blue Murder, because he did not know where I lived, and he'd never been to my home, especially the backyard, I can assure you. I would have to say that Ned Smith has always had this very, very nasty streak about him. The reason that I got so much information off Ned Smith, because Ned was a very jealous man. He was jealous of anybody else who he thought was doing better than him. And he would tell me things about blokes purely out of jealousy. Purely out of jealousy, because he didn't want to see them do any good for themselves. And that's a bad streak in someone. And that's why Ned was such a successful informant. Well, he said he wasn't, but I'm telling you, he was the best informant I ever had. And it was because of these traits he had. Jealousy, this hateful streak he had in him.
Did you have anything to do with the disappearance and the apparent murder of Christopher Flannery, the well-known hitman?
Christopher Flannery, I believe, was murdered probably through his connections with George Freeman. I've got no proof to that. I know that his wife rang me the day that he went missing. And asked me if I knew what had happened to him. By that stage, I'd had little to do with him. But what had happened just prior to him going missing, that I had been approached by Detective Superintendent Anderson, John Anderson, who was in charge of a task force to then look at the upsurge in underworld murders and what have you. And they asked me if I could contact Flannery and get him to come and see them and have a friendly conversation, because at that point of time he would have nothing to do with the police. So I was able to contact him through someone else I knew. We met at the Cricketers Club in Barrack Street. I did this for them because notwithstanding what had happened to me, I still believe in justice. And I don't think that people should be running around the street shooting other people. And I got him in, and I introduced him to John Anderson and his sidekick. I told him that I knew them well and that he could trust them if he wanted to talk to them. Now that would have been, I think, about a fortnight before. Mrs. Flannery rang me up because she knew that had happened, and asked me if I could contact them, which I did. I then contacted them to say that she had rung me to say that he was missing. I believe that he had become a complete nuisance. He was a hot-headed fellow. I believe that he would not discipline himself in regard to the way he got around Sydney. He was a Melbourne criminal, not a Sydney criminal, and he wasn't liked. And I really believe that he got to the point where the Sydney criminal milieu decided to get rid of him because he was a pest. And I think that's what happened to him. He was a pest, uncontrollable pest, and he was killed for that reason.
Well, that must have been an exciting time for a young detective. How old? You're 1960. How old are you when you first come to the cross?
In 1960, when I was doing that weekend vice squad work, I was actually 19. So I was born in 1941. So I was actually then a 19-year-old wet between the ears kid.
Exciting stuff.
Well, I thought it was fantastic. I mean, I just could not believe that I was doing what I was doing. I just loved police work, whether it was running around at Bankstown in uniform during the week and doing what we did, as I told you earlier, or else it was, you know, working on weekend vice squad work, the junior detective work we used to call it, peanutting, but it's a good name, isn't it?
That sounds
You're
good.
you're a fucking peanutter. But I think it's all right being a peanutter, but it's even worse if you're a fucking peanut.
Who ran the cross? Who ran in the 60s and 70s when you first came here? Who ran it?
When I first started to work at the cross and talking to senior detectives, and don't forget I was a very young bloke. It was obvious that Abe Saffron owned a lot of properties. He was involved with a guy named Peter Farr. I think Jim Anderson was somewhere around the place, but not as powerful as he was at that point. You had the gambling places. You had the likes of the Forbes Club, which had been going for, all right, mate, for many, many years. You had Joe Taylor was a guy that was around in Kellett Street. Joe had the Golden Nugget. Joe had been involved in nightclubs in much the same way as Abe Saffron had. And Joe Taylor was a terrific bloke. I can remember when he died, they had his funeral at St Mary's Cathedral. I think the Cardinal, it might have been Bluey Gilroy, he presided over his Requiem Mass. I think Fred Hanson, the police commissioner, went along, and there was a bit of criticism in the media about him going, but he said he was such a good man. He'd done a lot for charity. Perce Gallier was a guy mixed up with the Forbes Club. Perce was a name that everyone knew as a big punter. So these were guys that they didn't run the cross, but they ran their own things, and they all sort of worked in together. They must have all known each other, and they must have had an unofficial meetings to iron out any problems they had between themselves, because there never seemed to be a problem between them. They never complained about each other, and that's how it seemed to work. Abe, of course, with his lay girls, which was then a terrific place for people to go. I mean, it attracted all sorts of people, very wealthy people, normal people who liked to see something different. But there was no Mr. Big who ran the cross. I mean, Lenny McPherson wasn't here. There were none of those sort of people here. That didn't happen at all.
There were a number of gambling places around, mate. Obviously, it was sanctioned from somewhere. It was all, you know, it was fair enough. And how did that? What's your take on that? How did that work?
Well, I think it was. We had no legal casino as such, but we always had people who loved punting in Sydney. I know from reading the history of Randwick Racecourse. They say that during the Depression, there were more patrons getting off the trams at Randwick Racecourse to just have a flutter with a few bob that they'd got from the dole or wherever they got it from than before the Depression and after the Depression. So we've always had people who are in Sydney who have been mad gamblers, and all these places, they seem to have been there forever. I worked up here, and they were all there, and they were still there when I stopped working here until, of course, it was mainly Neville Rand. He decided to close all the illegal ones down, and then there was a white paper that I think he organised to be prepared about organising for legal casinos. And I think the original recommendation in this white paper, now I don't know who prepared it, but it was prepared for the Rand Labor government, was that there'd be 4 small casinos rather than one large one. But that never eventuated. We ended up with the one big one, and we've only still got the one big one now. But there were supposed to be 4 of them, which were to be spread all over the metropolitan area. That never eventuated. And I think that would have been a better idea. And they were supposed to be based on the London-style casinos, small, intimate places, very comfortable, you felt safe in, rather than some great big horrible joint like we've got now.
So, Roger, when you were actually on the vice squad, what did you practically do? Did you grab Sheilas? Did you?
We arrested prostitutes for working on certain streets, College Street, William Street. We arrested girls in the brothels where there were warrants for their arrest for non-payment of previous fines. We arrested, idiots playing up on the street for, well, offensive behaviour, which was sort of fucking around fighting each other. Pissing in the street was called indecent behaviour. Indecent language was fairly common, and blokes got locked up for it, for swearing, for saying fuck and cunt. And it was, treated. It was treated in courts. The maximum fine when I was a young cop was £5 or $10 for indecent behaviour, pissing in the street, offensive behaviour, which could incorporate fighting or unruly behaviour, and then the other one was. Well, that's right, swearing, indecent language, yeah.
How were the police treated in those days? I mean, what was the reaction if people started to give you a bit of lip? How was that taken?
If someone gave you lip, they were treated accordingly, and they got locked up for one of those offences. If the uniform truck was going by and he yelled out abuse, then those 2 cops would get out of their truck and try and arrest him. If he ran off, of course, that would be bad luck. But they would make every effort to throw him in for one of those street offences, and that's the Summary Offences Act, of course, was brought in for that purpose, and then taken away, of course, by Frank Walker and Neville Wren. And that's where the streets became dirty and messy again, because the police had lost that power to make a quick arrest for offensive behaviour, indecent language, or indecent behaviour. They went, the same as drunkenness went. I mean, we'd throw blokes in if you saw a drunk, for his own protection, you'd stop the truck and throw him in the back. Now that's whether it was a vice squad truck or a 21 division truck or a normal PD truck, because you put a bloke in the cell, he was locked up for drunkenness. If he had $1 or 10 bob, that was his bail after 4 or 5 hours after he'd sobered up. But if he was in a real bad way and it was night and it was winter time and cold, he'd stay there all day, he'd stay there all night.
Tell me about some of the places up around here. The Bourbon and Beefsteak, famous place. Take me through that.
Well, the Bourbon and Beefsteak came later. I was a detective at the. Actually, I was still working with Noel when the Bourbon and Beefsteak, or the Texas Tavern, was the first one to open. And I'll explain it this way: that the Chevron Hotel, which is no longer there, I think it's an Novotel now, down in Maclay Street. Bernie Houghton, with his connections with the CIA and the American military, obviously learned in advance that the R&R leave was going to take place in Sydney. And he also learned that they were going to take over the Chevron Hotel. Now, the Chevron was a famous hotel then. We had a great room there where Frank Sinatra used to perform, and they used to put on great shows there. Now, all right, it was starting to get a bit jaded, so I think they said, "Oh, well, we'll lease it out for the R&R." So, right opposite the old Chevron was a restaurant called the Copenhagen Restaurant. It was a restaurant with no windows. So Bernie bought that and spent a lot of money renovating it, and it became the Texas Tavern, opened as a Texas Tavern, right opposite. So that was where all the R&R Yanks, the Yanks on R&R, would come over with all their money that they'd saved up from being in Vietnam, and there we're just passing it now. That used to be the Texas Tavern, previously the Copenhagen, now it's the De Vere Hotel. And that of course, was the old Chevron. But by that point, of course, I because of an incident there, I got to know Bernie very, very well. The whole of Scott blokes got to know Bernie very, very well. And it was an arrangement that was arranged between the hierarchy of the squad and Bernie and his managers that we would look after both the bourbon and the Texas Tavern. So it was Bernie Houghton's first venture into property and running a business here, a huge restaurant, hotel. It was quite obvious that the fact that he was opening up the Texas down Macleay Street and taking business away from the middle of the cross was obviously upset a few of the locals up there. We received information that someone was going to throw a Molotov cocktail through the batwing doors of the Texas Tavern. We weren't quite certain for a few days exactly when it was going to happen, and then one of the guys got the exact information that was going to occur on this particular night. Now, from my recollection, the Texas Tavern had only been opened for a few nights, and of course it was very popular with the guys, of course, from the Chevron just walking across the road, and these American GIs, American soldiers. So I was one of the guys who was given the job of waiting in the foyer of the Texas Tavern. We were decked out in full leather protective gear, leather gauntlet gloves, and I think there were 3 of us there because that's about all who would fit in. We had cops up and down Macleay Street, and we were waiting there for this to happen. We didn't know what type of vehicle we were looking for at that point. After we've been there about half an hour, someone down the bottom of Macleay Street radioed to everyone to let us know that a Zephyr car, a Tourer, a ragtop, about a 1960 model, was coming up in the traffic. There's always heavy traffic on Macleay Street, back in those days as it is now. So with 3 guys in it, so we put 2 and 2 together and come up with the absolute possibility that had to be the suspect vehicle. We, sure enough, it slowly came up in the traffic, and when it got level with the batwing doors of the Texas Tavern, the guy in the back lit a Molotov cocktail, which was a long neck beer bottle with a wick and obviously half kerosene and half diesel. That used to be what they used to make Molotovs off in my day. And he heaved it straight through the batwing door. Well, I was standing right in the middle, and I was like a wicketkeeper. I caught this Molotov cocktail, this flaming bomb, and threw it straight back out, far better than Adam Gilchrist ever did. And it landed right in the back seat of the car, right almost on top of this jerk who had framed the thing. Of course, they were caught in the traffic. They couldn't sort of pull out alongside. They were sort of caught there, but they got a wriggle on and went up the road. And of course, it didn't take the blokes up the road long. We didn't have to tell them what car they were looking for. It was on fire, the whole bloody thing. The guys were quickly apprehended up the top of the street, and they had fire extinguishers up there and hit the car with the fire extinguishers, and of course the culprits were arrested. And that was the only ever attempt that I can remember on any of Bernie's premises. It wasn't that long after that he got the bourbon going, and it was an absolutely terrific place. And people said at the time that once the Yanks left, that both the bourbon and the Texas Tavern would close. Well, they didn't. They were unbelievably successful night joints, if you call them that. They always had great food, American food, tacos and that type of stuff. And they were successful, and the bourbon, notwithstanding that well, when Bernie died, of course, it all had to be sold up because of problems with wills and what have you. And but there's no comparison now between the new bourbon and the old bourbon. It was just a fantastic place for people to go to. And I went there. I went to basically the closing night. I was invited there by the manager, Mike Connors, who was actually the cousin of a police detective who unfortunately at that point had died. He'd been on the consortium squad for years, John Anderson, and Mike Connors was the manager, come licensee for all those years. And we actually had a very sad night there when the old bourbon closed, and never to be the same again. The only brief that I've actually got at home is the whole of the Lanfranchi brief. And my solicitor at the time, Val Bellamy, actually kept it for me. And I've got every statement. I've got the covering sheets, the original covering report I put for the coroner, and of course the coroner's report itself. And it's a very simple brief. Lanfranchi was a little shithead, He was running around, obviously dealing in heroin as well. He'd been released from jail. He'd served a sentence in jail for buggery. Now that's a pretty unusual offence. It's been in the Crimes Act for many, many years. But I think back in my day it was called the abominable crime of buggery. And he'd done a couple of years for it. And I'm told he viciously raped a male person and got 3 years for it. So that goes to show what sort of a bloke he is. So he's into armed robberies and he's into selling heroin. And of course he got with two other guys, Steve Pawley and Tiger Smith, and with the 2 or 3 other blokes he used on odd occasion, and they robbed 4 or 5 banks. Now, it was a normal investigation. I had blokes working on it. We all worked on it. We had him identified by his photograph as one of the bank robbers. He had a motorbike that he used to ride to where they had the getaway car. So they'd arrive in a side street, about a mile from where the bank to be held up was situated. Then he'd park his motorbike, and then they get in the car, then off they'd go and do the armed robbery, and then they roar back to the street where their other cars were and his motorbike. Now, old people, we talk about neighbourhood watch. Some old guy hears a bit of noise and looking out through his Venetian blinds, and of course, and then suddenly sees these people leave a bike and a car and go off in another car. They get suspicious. Then they'd roar back about 20 minutes later or 10 minutes later. And these guys, we had the numbers of his motorbike. We had him identified for buying the bike, buying cars. The whole thing was a very simple brief. And in a very short space of time, and as I said, I've got all these statements. I've still got these statements in my possession. We've got this brief, which we built up, identifying him, Steve Pawley, and Tiger Smith. Well, of course, we arrested Tiger Smith and we arrested Steve Pawley. They, in records of interview, completely involved Lanfranchi in the armed robberies. They blamed him for organising. They said he was the organiser. Pawley even said that he was getting heroin off Lanfranchi, and he owed him money for the heroin that he was supplying him. Pawley was a very smart young boxer. He was going really well. Become a junkie because of a jail term, and became dependent on heroin, and he was getting his heroin from Lanfranchi. So we got them in. Yes, they admitted their involvement. Yes, and they blamed him. We couldn't find Lanfranchi. We went everywhere. We kept knocking on the doors of his father's house, who hated us. We'd knock on the doors of all his associates, driving them mad. 2 or 3 in the morning, where's Warren? Where's Warren? Where's Warren? Finally, I got a phone call from Ned Smith, who was my informant, and I make no bones about it. And Smith said to me, I understand you're looking for a guy called Frenchy. Well, I didn't know that that was his nickname, but Frenchy was short for Lanfranchi. He was known as Frenchy. I said, yes. So I saw Ned Smith, and I said, this guy is wanted for the attempted murder of a policeman, because on the last occasion they tried to rob a bank, they were just about at the scene of the bank robbery, and they jumped a red light. A policeman on a motorcycle saw them, chased after them, drew alongside, and as is correctly depicted in Blue Murder, Lanfranchi got up from the back seat and pointed a gun at point-blank range through the back offside window of the car as the policeman drew alongside to come up to the driver, and attempted to pull the trigger. And it was a .357 Magnum, his own Magnum, which he'd hidden later on in Petersham Park, and which we found. But that is a true depiction of what happened. So had this gun not jammed, that policeman would be dead. So he was wanted for that. He was wanted for these bank robberies, and two guys from the homicide squad were down in Wollongong working on the murder down there of a drug dealer, and he was the #1 suspect, that he'd been involved with this bloke in Wollongong, selling him heroin. This guy had been found with his head bashed in, and the forensic people said he'd been bashed to death with a baseball bat, and that's exactly what happened. Now later on, after I'd shot Lanfranchi, they actually found the baseball bat, and it had forensic evidence that Lanfranchi had been the offender. So here's Neddy Smith ringing me saying, oh, you want to talk to Frenchy. Frenchy wants to know if he can talk to you. Can he do business with you? I said, well, there's been no business going on, mate, because this bloke is wanted for all these crimes. But I said, he's almost a cop killer. It's just, he's lucky that somehow his gun didn't fire. We knew this from talking to Constable Walker. Senior Constable Walker was the name of the policeman. He said he heard the click, click, click of the gun. So, but I said, let me go back and talk to my bosses. So I went back and saw my superiors, and I said, look, we're having trouble finding this bloke. He's hard to find. We've got the others in. We've got a perfect brief on him. I didn't have to say one word to Warren Lanfranchi. People say, oh, well, you'd have probably had to verbal him, or you would have probably had to load him up. I'm telling you now, there was no need to. We had a perfect brief. We had civilian identification. We've tracked him, his identification through the motorbike. Everything was it was a perfect brief. So it was just a matter of grabbing him by the scruff of the neck and putting him straight in the dock. And so that's how good the brief was. So I said to my superiors, look, he's come back through Smith, my informer, and I said, he wants to talk to me. And I said, we can either set him up, ambush him, and get him that way. If we don't get him that way, I don't know any other way of getting him at this stage. We'll just we'll fluke him on the street. But, a guy like him is a very dangerous person, especially when he's confronted by police, especially when we seen what he tried to do to Senior Constable Walker. He was just doing his job and had no idea that these blokes were going to rob a bank. So my bosses agreed, yes, set him up. So Ned came back to me and said, okay. He said, I told Ned, I said, you tell him, yes, I'll talk to him, and you blokes, you organise the next move. You tell me where you want to meet. So there was a bit of backwards and toing and froing, and then finally we agreed that on the Saturday we'd meet somewhere. And it was a Saturday, the 27th of June, 1981. And so we're all at work, ready. I had a big team at work, ready to get on with this operation. And so Ned rang, he said, righto, he said, have you heard of Dangar Place, Chippendale? And I said, no, I haven't, but we'll look it up in the street directory. So Dangar. I'm sure Ned, who's got a bit of a warped sense of humour himself, I think Ned must have thought it was danger rather than Dangar, but it was Dangar. Anyhow, so I looked it up and I saw it ran parallel with Cleveland Street. It ran off Abercrombie Street, and we raced it and had a look, and there was there was a Taubman's paint factory which was partly being demolished, and it was at the back of the old Taubman's paint factory. The whole area was basically an old factory area which was being demolished, and now if you go there it's gentrified. There are beautiful townhouses, etc., etc. This is the position where we arranged to meet. They mentioned Dangar Place, Nettie mentioned Dangar Place, which is of course round the corner from here. But a street director, he said, well, it's Beaumont Street, but he also mentioned opposite the Britannia Hotel. Of course, that is the Britannia Hotel. Nettie pulled up in an old BMW, they drove up this way, he pulled up over there, they both got out of the car, Ned gave him a light pat down, and then Warren Lanfranchi walked directly towards me, and then when he got to about here, he kept walking into the lane, into Beaumont Street, heading towards Dangar Place. And as he did so, I then followed him. So of course at this point, he's about 2 metres ahead of me. He's turned right here into Dangar Place to walk up there. And of course I'm following him. I knew that Detective Sergeant Fraser was lying on the back floor of a car parked where that little blue car is. And I could see a car coming down the hill, which I knew contained Detective Sergeant Harding and Detective Rod Moore. But I've kept walking with him. He was very, very towy. I had heard Detective Sergeant Fraser get out of the car. He was armed with a shotgun. Of course, so did Warren Lanfranchi. We both realised that there was a car coming towards us that I knew contained Detective Sergeant Harding and Detective Moore. Well, because at that point of time, he was very, very towy, absolutely jumping. So with that, he said words to the effect that it was an ambush, and I basically agreed with him. And because at that point of time, he then suddenly just backed around and pulled this gun out from these very tight trousers. And as he was bringing it up, I realised this bloke's going to shoot me. So I reached behind for my gun, and of course I didn't mess around, and I brought it up and I fired one shot, and then fairly quickly after that I fired a second shot, and of course it killed him, and he fell over in the gutter and dead. Well, Ned did exactly what my superiors told me to tell him to do. As I said, we had a perfect brief. All we needed was the body. So at that point, as I said, he's like a taut bit of fishing line. He's that tense. And so with that, of course, he just swung around and gone backwards, back towards the car, which is coming down behind him. And that's when he's reached down the front of his pants and pulled out this Harrington and Richardson gun. Now, I know it's an old gun, and it wasn't his normal gun. His normal gun was a .357 Magnum. And let me tell you this, that the reason he had that was that his father himself was a gun dealer. And his father had a big safe at home where all the guns he was working on, that he was selling, that he was buying, etc., by law had to be inside that safe. This particular weekend, the father was not home. The only gun that was there was this Harrington and Richardson. Now, what had happened is that he was so towy about us catching him that he had a steel box, and he had put the gun and a lot of the money and bits and pieces in this box, and he'd hidden it up in Petersham Park, opposite the old Lewisham Hospital. In fact, we found out about it, and I sent a search party out to Petersham Park, and it was found. It was found, and that gun was put to a test, a forensic test, and they were able to show that after so many firings, it jammed. It jammed. As a matter of fact, a guy who became a well-known senior police officer, Detective Superintendent Bob Inkster, was then a detective senior constable. He was one of the guys that we'd sent out on this search party, and he actually found this tin box with all Lanfranchi's gear in it, including the .357 Magnum. So we got that Magnum back. But getting back to the gun he had, was one from his father's workshop, you might say. But it was perfectly lethal. It would kill someone had a shot been fired from it. It was loaded. It was a revolver, and that's the gun he had. And as I said, there was no doubt he would have shot me with that gun had I not just been a bit quicker than him, and I had my .38 stuck down the back of my pants. So I pulled it out, and I didn't muck around. 2 shots. Now, there's been all this nonsense about some women down the street saying the shots were 11 seconds apart, 13 seconds apart, 2 seconds apart, 8 seconds apart. Let me tell you, I was taught to fire in a combat style shooting. With a revolver, you've got 6 shots. So you fire quickly. You don't cock the gun. You pull through from the. So you go, bang bang, bang bang, bang bang, and that's how you fire it. And that's how I fired the gun that day. And of course, these people were interviewed by, people, lawyers for them, and they were trying to build up a story, trying to build up a cock and bull story. And that's one of the things that they say, it was 11 seconds. How could these girls say they heard there was 11 seconds delay between the bangs? Because we're talking about Cleveland Street, cars backfiring, etc. Traffic, busy, very busy thoroughfare on a Saturday afternoon.
You were basically accused at various points in time of murdering him. What do you say to that accusation?
I've been accused of, mainly by, the media, only the media, of murdering Lanfranchi. And I've got books and books and books at home written by, mainly journalists. And out of all those books, only 2 of those journalists have ever had the decency to at least contact me and ask me for my own opinion. But they've written these books, reading all the other books, watching Blue Murder. Blue Murder seems to have become something like the Bible. Well, if it happened on Blue Murder, it must be factual, it must be gospel. And I heard someone recently making a comparison, but Rogerson's version is different to Blue Murder, which by suggesting, well, Rogerson's version can't be right because it's not the same as how he's depicted in Blue Murder. Now, of course, we go to the version in Blue Murder, which I think is based again on Neddy's book and his recount of things, where you see Richard Roxburgh playing Roger Rogerson actually shooting Lanfranchi right in the middle, shooting him dead right in the middle of Cleveland Street, right outside the Britannia Hotel, that's the correct name for the pub. And then all the coppers run out of the pub, pick him up, pick his lifeless body up, and then march him around the corner and dump him in Dangar Place. To me, it's never made sense. And I can even remember, Ian David, the scriptwriter of Blue Murder, being cross-examined by Arnie Tees, who had left the cops by that stage and was my lawyer because I'd been summoned to an inquest into the death of Brian Alexander, and he cross-examined Ian David about that scene because they played scenes of Blue Murder at this inquest. Like Blue Murder is sort of a historical truth, historical fact, and you could rely on the film as evidence as to what really happened, as to the truth. And Ian and Arnie said, well, it seems strange. Why would you want to shoot? Why would Rogerson shoot Lanfranchi, murder him in the middle of Cleveland Street, where if you're really planning to murder him, you could murder him round the corner in Dangar Place where no one was looking, no one from the public was looking. But Ian David, his comment was, well, and I've actually got his exact words still at home, well, he said, no, he said there was more forensic evidence that, as far as I was concerned, to suggest that Lanfranchi was shot by Rogerson right in the middle of Cleveland Street. That's his own evidence on oath at an inquest. At an inquest. So when you're faced with those sort of situations, how are you ever going to convince someone that what they're saying is wrong? He would be convinced to this day, Ian David, that I shot Lanfranchi, I murdered him right in the middle of Cleveland Street. And no one will ever change his mind, I'm sure. When I shot Lanfranchi, I was commended by the police commissioner. He knew the whole circumstances. And I was even given a few days off. And I took my then wife away for a few days because we were getting massive amounts of bad publicity. His father got on the bandwagon. I can't blame the father and I can't blame his brother. I'd probably be doing exactly the same myself. But they were making allegations which were completely unfounded, but I accepted what they were saying, as I'd probably do that myself. I was trying to protect my brother, who probably was a little shithead, but when you see him killed like this, you think, well, maybe there was some other way of doing it without killing him. But as I said, had he given himself up, had he wandered into a police station and said, "My name's Warren Lanfranchi, and I understand the police want to interview me or talk to me," it would have been a matter of putting him straight in the dock. The brief was that good. Where this affected my career was this, that, yeah, we went through the Lanfranchi inquest, and then there was a siege out at Cogra. And there was a guy there, I think he was a Yugoslav, and he'd continually belted his missus and treated her like a dog. And this particular night, he'd put a shocking act on at home, threatened to kill her. She'd rung the police, or the neighbours had rung the police, and of course we were called out there. Now I went out purely as the SWAT supervisor. I was not armed other than just my normal service revolver, which I always carried with me. There were ballistic guys out there, there were blokes a lot senior to me, there was the superintendent of police, and the ballistics blokes acted when this guy came out on the front lawn and started firing this .22 at anywhere, anything, any movement he started firing. And the police reacted, the ballistics guys, they reacted and shot him dead. Well, next day, there was headlines, Rogerson at this news scene, man shot down like a dog, some words to that effect. It was headlines. And the Deputy Commissioner at the time, Barney Ross, he reckoned he had enough of this, and he reckoned I'd seen enough of bloodshed and violence. I think that wasn't the reason. I think he was sick of seeing my name at all these scenes. That was the job I was doing. Someone called me to go out there. I didn't volunteer to go there. Someone told me to go out there. Someone directed me to go there. You go there. I was a mid-ranking sergeant. There was an inspector, a superintendent, and the ballistics guys who are, all professional ballistics experts, great shots. But this is the media twisted around. Roger got the blame. So I then went to Darlinghurst. But it all happened. I mean, they used all these things against me eventually when Avery became the police commissioner. And that was the end of it, basically.
Are you bitter about what happened?
I was very bitter originally, especially in regard to the way Commissioner Avery treated me, and I have no respect for that man whatsoever. I refer to him as Dribbling Jack Avery. I've learned a lot about Dribbling Jack Avery. He was a drunk. He was a tenterfield in other police stations. And this is all factual stuff. I've spoken of police that he's worked with, and the guy was an alcoholic. And yet he was allowed to come back to Sydney because he was so ill that his doctors up there recommended he come back to Sydney for treatment. Yes, he certainly had treatment. He turned his life around. He then decided he would go to university. He did a Bachelor of Arts degree, then a Master of Arts. He wrote a book on community policing, and some jerk in government got hold of it. I think it was the Police Minister, Peter Anderson, and they thought, we'll run with this, community policing. I mean, the first thing Jack Avery did when he became police commissioner, and this qualifies what I'm saying, he said, we shouldn't be a police force, we should be a police service. And what have we seen of recent years? We had the police minister change it back to force because it sounded better. We should be a force. We should be there. We shouldn't be there lovey-dovey. We should be there. If you're fighting against criminals, it is a war, and you need to be forceful, you need to be strong, and you treat them as an enemy, and that's how it should be. Not this service, lovey-dovey, put your arm around them and give them a second chance, smack their bottoms and send them home. And that was Jack Avery's ideal. But that was his background. He'd been a uniformed cop, and the stories I've got back from people about just what he was really like. But of course that was hidden from the government.
Diamonds in his eyes, kind that you can't see inside your disguise. It's where he wants to be. You think that you're so smart with everything you say, that he can feel your heart every game you play.